Hey everyone, just want to come at you real quick here with this week's recap as we entered into part 2 of God's big story and finding ourselves in that. And just a recap of last week, we talked about creation and how God in creation, we learn our beginning, we learn our purpose, and we learn our place. We learn those three things from the beginning story. And we learn that God is our beginning. God spoke us into existence. Our purpose, we were created in the image of God, humans in the image of God, to rule in goodness and righteousness as He is good and righteous. And He is the ruler of all. We were created to reflect Him here on earth and be His representatives in goodness and righteousness. And so that's the way everything was at the beginning. Not just us, but everything was good as God Himself said it was. And then we learned our place is that we're the created, not the creator. We don't own and rule and sustain everything. God does. And so that kind of puts us down to sizes. We would rather the world be about us, and we would rather us be the rulers. God is the ruler and the creator, sustainer of everything, and He created everything in goodness. And so the first part of the story is great. It's amazing and beautiful and perfect. And then part 2, act 2, scene 2, whatever you want to call it. Enter brokenness, fallenness, the collapse. Desolation, ruin, destruction. That's what's darkness. That's what's brought into the world with the collapse, the fall, rebellion of mankind, of Adam and Eve, our first parents. And so there were 4 questions that we said kind of naturally arise from the text. I'm going to run through those really quickly and then get to how we live in light of the fall, the collapse. The first question was, why didn't the fall of rebellion of Satan ruin everything like our fall did? The really simple answer is Satan is not us. Satan was an angel, not created in the image of God, not to rule over this earth in goodness and righteousness. He was an angel, but there's something that's weighty to being human. There's something powerful about being a human created in the image of God that Satan just does not have. And so when he rebelled, we do know it happened before our rebellion, but we're not exactly sure when, and we're not given really the details of that, and we don't need them. Why? Because Satan's fault is not nearly as significant as ours. Okay, so that's the short answer to that one. Question number 2 is, what was the sin that Adam and Eve committed? Conclusion from the text was the sin that they committed. They were not overtly trying to rebel against God. They were not mad at God. They were not angry at Him. They were just deceived into thinking that wisdom, and this is like, if you want to call the underlying sin of all the rest of our sins that we commit, they sought wisdom outside of God. God was all that Adam and Eve needed. He provided them with everything that they needed, but Satan comes along in the form of the serpent and says, did God really say? He doesn't want you to eat it because you're not going to die. You're going to become like Him. The irony of that statement is that they already were like Him, created in His image, and up to that point, all they knew was goodness. They didn't know anything of evil. They didn't know this good versus evil that we know of today. So that was question number 2. The sin was they sought wisdom outside of God, and that's what all of us try to do, right? Try to seek life and wisdom outside of God. And then the second question that kind of came up, so how did their sin affect them? Here's what was introduced in the world when Adam and Eve fell and rebelled. Guilt and shame, blame, and division. Man, aren't all of those things stuff that we're guilty of and things that we sense and feel and understand deeply here in this side of Eden, right? We get those things. And that's what was introduced in the world. And most importantly, death was introduced into the world, something that was foreign to the world up to that point. Death is introduced. We see that at the end of the chapter when they're kicked out of the garden, and we see that in chapter 4 when Cain kills his brother Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. Okay, and then the last question is, so how did their sin affect others? It broke everything else. It brought pain into the world. We see that with Eve. It brought toil and fruitless work into the world. It brought women wanting to be the man and trying to blur the lines between the differences between man and woman. Those good things that God created, that's going to be blurred. Man's going to rule not in goodness and righteousness, but in abuse of power. And man, don't we just see all of those things around us today? So those were kind of the questions that we went through and discussed. So how do we live in light of the fall? Ask yourself this question: do you see yourself as sinful? Do you see yourself as sinful? Or do you think you're mostly good? You just do some bad things. Do you see the world around you as sinful? Do you think people are mostly good, or that naturally we're sinful and that's just our natural inclination? The Bible would tell us we are sinful. That is our natural inclination after the fall, after the collapse of creation. And then, so those were the questions we asked you to process. And here's the practices that we want you implement. Maybe you can implement these as a family, or help your kids implement these at the end of each day. Spend some time using discernment. Try to ask God to help you identify the sins that you committed throughout the day. And then the second thing is confession. Confession is agreeing with God, agreeing that something you've done or said or thought or didn't do was sinful, as God calls it sinful. And confess to Him and go to Him. And so while this part of the story, everything's dark, it's ruin, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Read Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Maybe it's 16, 15 and 16. And God leaves hope, light at the end of the tunnel. The offspring of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. And so there's hope at the end of the tunnel, but things are broken. And we believe that this story, the story of God, actually explains the world the best. And the reason that's so is because it's the true story. It's the story of God and our story within His story. So pray that you find this helpful, and that you all can grow together as a family in understanding the story of God, and even how to articulate that and how that story impacts our day-to-day life.